Welcome to the Hive Mind Podcast, where the community reaches out and talks to us. I am thrilled to welcome Micheal from the TheMegaMagikarp onto the channel as a new co-host. Micheal, would you like to briefly introduce yourself?
I'm Michael. I played Magic for the last 8 years. Kind of semi-retired content creator. Kind of dipping my toes back into it now, seeing how things go.
All right, and if you guys want to find him, I'm sure we'll have the links in the show notes below if you want to find him on whatever socials he's on. So today we're talking about turn equity, specifically in Commander, and we talked about this a little bit the other night too. The thing I find interesting about it is that you kind of looked at it from the perspective of somebody who's playing like a durdely deck that's kind of like a little bit slower. And I always think of it from the perspective of somebody who's kind of popping off and storming off and taking a long time to get to the end of the game. What we mean by turn equity here is you're taking way more time in the game than other people are. This is something I think everybody's experienced. Everybody's had the game where somebody is taking a million game actions or trying to figure out a million game actions or trying to resolve a million triggers, and everybody's just on their phone while they figure it out, which is obviously
Yeah,
not fun.
yeah. So the reason I came from the perspective I did is because I'm actually a really big perpetrator of those really long turns. I play several decks that involve some relatively blinky strategies, some very heavily trigger intensive game actions, something where I'll have a single creature enter the battlefield and I'll have multiple different things trigger at the same time. It can just be a lot to handle for a lot of people, especially if you're trying to go and feel out a deck for the first time. Like if you could imagine somebody piloting a rune deck for the first time or a Brago deck, you can kind of come to the conclusion that is like, oh, this is going to be a while before this turns over, isn't it?
Yeah, you definitely see that a lot with blink decks. Anything that's abusing ETB is really going to put a lot of triggers on the stack at the same time when you're blinking your whole board. Praga is obviously a big contributor to that. I actually am more of a Storm player, and Micheal knows this, and it's actually one of the reasons I wanted him on the show, is because we have a lot of differing opinions. We actually like very different forms of Magic quite often, and I like that we have this discourse. But I'm typically storming off, and I always feel bad about it. I always feel bad when I'm playing Storm deck, and it's like, hang on, I got a ritual, I got to draw cards, and you got to reassess the situation every time you've drawn a card. So it ends up taking a long time. And if you don't win that game, right then and there, like at least if you win it, people get a little bit of catharsis, right? But if you don't win, you've kind of just wasted their time because you've amassed this gigantic board, and there's probably nothing they can do anyway, but they still have to play through their turn, and it's nowhere near as fun or interesting because they're not taking a million game actions like you just did.
I think that the reason why I personally got turned off from Storm decks is many years ago, I built a Melek, is a Paragon deck. It's the 6 mana weird commander where you can play with the top card of your library or field, and if you play an instant or sorcery off the top of your deck, you get copies of that spell. It was a $50 brew of a Spell Slinger deck at the time. This was 2019 or so, and this deck took 18 extra turns in a single turn. It took 16 of those 18 extra turns for me to definitively say, okay, I've won the game. I kind of had my fill of I'm going to fork all of my effects. I'm going to resolve a bunch of spells on the stack in one shot, kind of fail to last me a lifetime. So I've kind of moved away from that kind of spell slinger thing because of my own irresponsibility when it comes to building that style of deck.
Something I'm sure somebody will mention in the comments. Does it
Yeah.
count as bad turn equity if it's multiple turns?
Yeah.
I think it's disingenuous to say no, right? But
Yeah,
like
oh, absolutely.
extra turns are kind of their own problem. I think it really sucks because extra turns really do fit in certain decks, but it always feels miserable to watch somebody take an extra turn. Even if you didn't lose a turn, it feels like you've lost a turn.
It's
It's just I
especially
don't know.
bad because a lot of players will not take into consideration, oh, I'm just going to go put in one extra turn to try to win the game. That's how I have a couple of extra turns on my decks. But for the most part, if you put a Time Warp in your deck, you're going to go want to put in a Karn's Temporal Sundering, the 9 mana one that everybody hates. Everybody and their mother is
Expropriate.
going to start, yeah, expropriate. Thank you. every single time you consider a spell like that, there comes to a point of, well, if I'm playing one of these, I'm probably going to want to play more. And so that kind of trickle down effect can really be problematic.
If you play expropriate, or if someone plays expropriate against you and you do not pick money, I hate you. That card
Yeah,
always wins games because someone is always sure that it's better to give them time, and it's not. It's
yeah.
not. If we think of extra turns as, being the same turn as far as, like, Storm goes and that kind of thing, or just even I guess in the case of Durdling, because usually extra turn spells aren't that good if you're not doing a bunch of things, right? It's just an untap, and we have other effects that also untap all your permanents, draw cards. But if you think of it
I
that way,
only,
like, it gets really obnoxious. It feels
yeah,
bad.
I only have an extra turn in a couple of different decks. One of them is, I swear to God, it's not a Storm deck. I have it in Joyra, the middle one, the 4 mana one, wherever you cast a historic spell, draw a card. Mine is much less powerful than most of the other brews, but I include it just because it's a legendary sorcery, so it triggers her. I also have that same spell in my mono blue Voltron deck, just because I wanted to be able to have another way of killing another person in the same turn. But yeah, for the most part, extra turns are very much a big contributor of this. One thing I wanted to bring to attention that I don't think covers the scope of what we're discussing today, and I wanted to make sure that we were clear on this, was people who are unfamiliar with the game, because somebody who's new to the game or is a younger player of this game is going to have longer turns taking the same actions that you and I would as experienced players. But I don't think that we need to include them into this, and we need to make sure that, yeah, somebody who's new to the game is obviously going to not be as fluent with their motions as we're going to be, but we're not going to be trying to pick on players like that in this discussion.
If you're a new player listening to this podcast, you're not the people we're talking about here. We're talking about seasoned players who are not actually doing anything or are taking extra game actions to extending their turn and the frustrations around that. Learning the game is part of the game, and I always welcome new players in the group, and I'm always happy to help them along. Obviously, you will learn your deck in time. You should try to learn your deck and the combos or whatever you put in it. You should learn how that works so that you're not wasting time, ours and yours. But this isn't really an issue that we're taking with you specifically. This is more the people who are dirtling or storming off, and whether that's okay, basically, and how we can kind of reduce some of the friction that causes.
One thing you did touch on that I think actually is a really big contributor to game states taking as long as they can for some turns is actually what you mentioned about learning your deck and being able to play it out. If you have a brand new deck that's very dirtily heavy and you're playing it for the first time, it can be a learning experience for everybody involved. But if you put in the repetitions for a deck and you kind of learn the way that it plays out, you can mitigate some of the issues which we're bringing up today. It's not like it's another Bant Blink deck. It's going to be a 20-minute turn just so they can deal 5 damage to each of us, and so they draw 10 cards. That was a waste of a Netflix show worth of my time. You can get to a point with some decks where you can make your game actions much quicker with time.
Yeah, I think if you're communicating well with your play group, especially if it's people you know, you can kind of skip through the triggers and say like, "Hey, I'm going to put plus and counters on all my guys because that's what this does when it ETBs." You don't need to confirm each and every single trigger or whatever. If your teammates are probably going to tell you like, "Hey, I want to interact. I want to kill this thing before it gets too big or whatever." If you know what's happening, then it's fine. It's easy to overwhelm yourself doing this too. I've played a lot of blink decks in my time, and it's especially bad with things like counters or things you have to turn over or transform, where you have to physically put your hands on objects for the game. And that can be part of it too. Maybe cut out some of those. Academy Manufacturer is actually a really big problem in this regard, and I cut it for most of my decks because it
Really.
just takes too much time to resolve making 3 of every token every time.
I can definitely see that. I've not run manufacturer in a moment myself, just because I've actually not run into a ton of situations where the decks I actively play want that card in the first place. Like the only deck of mine that would want it probably right now was Ziatora, the Incinerator, but I've simply not found space in the deck for it, so I haven't tried it. But having to manhandle all of the different treasure token productions in the deck already can be problematic, so I could only imagine how much more convoluted it would be with a bunch of clues and food added to the mix.
Everybody's had at least one game object deck, I feel like, at this point, because they print them all the time. Everybody's had either a food deck or a treasure deck or a gold deck or, what are some of the other ones? A junk deck with the new cards. Imagine just having to do 3 times the amount of management, and it's not even the same token. And it doesn't even, like, get to the point where you're playing, like, Urza, where you wanna tap some of them for mana, but not sack them. Like, and now you've gotta have 2 of every token, because you have to keep track of which one's tapped and which not. It becomes a logistics nightmare, as is. And on top of all that, everybody has to sit there and wait for you to figure it out. It's just not a good time. And
Which
Academy
then
Manufacturer, like, is so egregious to this in this regard that I might play it in some of my decks, but if I play on someone's stream or I play with people who are donating their time to come play with me, then I'm just not gonna play it because it's just gonna be so obnoxious and hard to keep track of, especially on something like Webcam Commander.
Yeah, that is its own can of worms where some cards just straight up don't work, like which gets into a category of spell that I think definitely contributes to this. Try to resolve a scramble verse over webcam. Tell me how much your friends like you after that.
Pro tip: just don't play Scrambleverse. Just don't play those cards.
That's going to just encourage people who already want to play those cards even more.
Yeah, probably. Like, I'm not telling people not to play certain cards. Like, play them if you want to play them. But if you're gonna play Scrambleverse, I mean, don't. But if you're gonna play like Academy Manufacturer, you need to lock in and be on top of it. That's the number one thing. Is like if you're playing a deck that you know can do lots of game actions, then you need to be responsible for making that go as quickly as possible to get through your turn and actually contribute to the board state. And we talked about that last night too, where I'm okay with you taking lots of game actions if you're actually contributing to the game state or if you're interacting with me in some way, because then at least I'm involved. But if I can sit on my phone through your entire turn, then you either need to win the game or you need to maybe play a different deck.
I found that the deck that I've played that is most no nonsense that can feel slightly dirtily and maybe slightly bad on turn equity, but not so much as to make people feel bad about it, is my mono red Neheb deck, which is a retrofit of a Lip Chandra deck. So it's a mono red burn deck with something around 12 planeswalkers, a little bit of counter manipulation stuff, but still a lot of the big burn payoffs you would expect. So the turn ends up going something along. I uptick my Chandra, deal 2 damage to each of you. Uptick this Chandra, deal damage to you. Go to combat, smack you in the face, copy some triggers, and then crackle with power. X equals enough to kill everybody. It's a little bit of a convoluted turn, sure, and if somebody has some interaction piece with my spell, it could make the entire turn feel like it took slightly longer than what it should have, but it's not nearly as egregious as resolving a single ephemerate and then having 20 new game pieces enter the board and drawing 7 cards.
Yeah, I mean, if somebody like combos out and actually casts a burn spell, like that was cool. They assembled a combo. They assembled this game-winning thing. It's more so when you have to wait for the game state to catch up. That's the annoying thing. And it's funny because on Magic Online, this is kind of like a dual-edged problem where you actually have a clock that you have to keep up with, but also the game will do all the game actions for you as long as it doesn't crash. I find that to be really an interesting thing that some decks are like better for turn equity on Commander Online, for Magic Online
The
specifically versus
That is something I
paper.
did not consider in the moment, but there are absolutely some cards that are better in paper commander compared to digital formats like Magic Online. A really good example of this is actually a deck I built for Saffron Olive for his Commander Clash about a year and some change ago. It was a deck that had a ton of mandatory triggers like Catacomb Sifter. Whenever a creature you control dies, scry 1, which in paper, if you get to a point where there's a card that you want on top already, you can just be like, I'm just going to ignore these triggers for the rest of the turn and just go from there. You
Can
don't
I,
have that ability on Magic
can I
Online.
interrupt you real quick?
Yeah.
This card is the bane of my existence because I play it in Xavier Sal and I make a million copies. I know this pain. I know this pain very well. In the video version of this, I'll put this on the card on screen and you guys will understand. Please continue.
That entire deck, when everything was said and done, it took 30 minutes of in game time to reach a board state where there were so many triggers on the stack that the entire client crashed. And during the midst of the entire thing going on, they fast forwarded through in half an hour of his turn, and somebody made a comment about, hey, we could probably go and start and finish a fantasy football league in the time it takes for him to finish this turn. And it was very funny, but also I would not want to do that to my friends on a consistent basis.
Yeah, it's the worst. And unfortunately, there's some limitations with Magic Online in that regard, but also just having to resolve triggers in totality and not being able to skip things like Scry 1, definitely a contributing factor. I would say if you're playing Magic Online, one, be respectful of your opponent's time and actually pass priority for one. Shout out to all the people who are AFK getting drinks right now in Magic Online.
Shopkeep stops that.
It happens every time without fail. If it's the person whose turn is after yours, like fine, you'll probably be back in time. But F6 or something, like if you're gonna be gone, like don't hold priority over the table, please. But that's something too, is like holding priority and things like that. In some cases, people want to interact with you, right? On your storm turn or on a really big durdely turn. And they kind of have to like wait for the opportune moment. And they're just waiting for you to complete a million actions. That's a thing too. Sometimes you might want to just like ask, like, hey, this is going to cause a million triggers. Does anyone want to interact with this now? Because it's going to be unfun, probably. And you don't have to say it in so many words, I guess, but keep in mind that your
Yeah.
opponents have to interact with you or they want to interact with you. And if your turn is largely not able to be interacted with, that's going to be very unfun. You got to remember that it's a multiplayer thing. You're not there to play, what's the game that everybody is? Solitaire. You're not there to play solitaire by yourself. It's just obnoxious. I know that that's unavoidable in some decks. Like, I'm not saying that this is like 100% something you can avoid. Sometimes this happens and decks pop off and pods are balanced in such a way. But it's definitely like feels bad if no one can interact with your deck and you are creating a million game objects or having to take a million game actions and you can't just speed through it. You can speed through it fine. Like there's a lot of things you can, but you might want to think about that when you're actually building your deck.
One thing that definitely comes to mind for this sort of thing is I can imagine every single one of my decks. I have 19 commander decks. Every single one could possibly get into a board state where there's a ton of interaction between the pieces going on. I love my Rube Goldberg machines. I love having a bunch of different triggers going on. I love holding priority at weird times to go do odd game actions. And I think everybody's deck, well, not everybody's deck, but a lot of decks out there can certainly have those sort of big turns. And I don't think that what I want people to walk away with this is like them to think that big turns are inherently a bad thing. It's a matter of trying to just treat the other people in the group with enough respect to be like, there's a lot going on here, and I'm trying my best to go play through it as efficiently as I can. And I'm not trying to waste anybody's time.
Absolutely. A thing that's going to happen, like no matter what, like even if you're conscious of this, this is going to happen both with your decks and your opponent's decks. And I think the other side of the coin on this is that it feels good to have these long turns. It feels good to take a lot of game actions and to make a million game objects. So it's like one of these things where they really encourage you to do these kind of things, and you kind of have to find the balance of how much time is this going to take and how much fun am I going to have because it's a shared experience, right? So if you're going to be having these big turns and these big board states, then you want it to be in a way that is interacting with your opponent and giving them something to do or something to think about. It's not like a bad thing by itself. It's just something that tends to feel bad when you're across the table from it. So it's something you really
I
got to
rem-
think about a little bit more.
I remember one time I made a board state happen to where I tapped a single Gaia's Cradle, or the flipped Itlamok rather,
Hmm.
for 4.6 quadrillion mana. That was one of the most fun games I had, mostly just because as soon as I did the math on how much mana I made, I'm like, okay, I can easily just go and play these four other spells right here, and I've won the game. But that also had a little bit of a lead up into it, where the board state had allowed me to get to such a position with
Hmm.
something like 10 Nyx Bloom Ancients. I'm really into degenerate stuff like that. But the turn ended up playing out much more quickly after I realized just how many resources I had available to me. And most of the time, a well built deck will have the means to end the entire game if they reach a point where they have that many resources, which that is another big thing. This probably leads into some things other people have said in the past where players need to have definitive win cons in their deck in order for them to actually make those turns end more quickly. In that scenario, for me, it was just drawing literally through my entire deck. I'm like, Pelidar Sovereign, put it in play. Teferi's Protection, I have like 500 life. There's literally nothing you can do about it. I win the game on my next turn.
That's actually something we talked to Kurohitsky about too when we did the combos episode, where we just feel like if you have a combo, then you have an out. Like when you get to these ridiculous board states, and it feels good to be able to actually end the game because it feels bad to amass a huge board state and then lose because it didn't actually matter. I generally advocate for that anyway.
I personally actually have had several games where I've quote unquote done the thing, the board state where I have a bajillion Nyx Blooms. And if I were to have only killed a single person, or maybe not even that, and just lost the next turn, I did the thing. I don't care. I feel like I accomplished what I came here to do. Usually, if doing the thing does involve winning the game for most players. I'm not saying that just because my deck did the thing doesn't mean that I don't want to win. But I feel as like if I just happened to get got by a silver bullet immediately after my deck went off and I lost afterwards, as long as I'm not sitting there Armageddon and without any permanents and cards in hand for 20 minutes afterwards, and if I just lose in a very quick manner, I'm like, okay, I'm satisfied with this outcome.
Popping off is fine. For most people, I think that's enough to actually have fun. But I think in the context of like your turn taking a long time, having an out is pretty
Oh yeah,
nice. Like it doesn't have to be like specifically I include Walking Ballista in my deck because I know I'll make infinite mana at some point. But something, put a Crater Hoof in your deck or whatever suits your play style or a Crackle with power or whatever you want to do.
yeah. Don't just throw in a Avengers Zendikar and just say, "Oh, I'm gonna blink this like 6 or 7 times, then I'll play a single land and I'll get them with 1/2s eventually." Like that's not really gonna work out as well as you want it to. I know from experience.
You do what you gotta do, but try not to like muck up the board state without a plan to actually do something with it. I also think the power level plays a little bit into this because in casual gameplay, I think that if you have a route to victory, I think it's better to just go for it rather than build up additional resources. But when you're playing in higher power pods, especially when you get into CDH, you're going to find that people want you to play around interaction. And in that case, I feel like it's generally accepted that if you're going to take a long turn because you can play around interaction, you should because you're playing to win. But in casual, like I think I would always try to go for the fun or good or game winning play without having to build up an additional board state because it's just not helpful. It just takes up extra time. And most of the time, if you get blown out, you're going to lose all your stuff anyway. If you're playing in lower power pods, like that's something to keep in mind is that you should probably just go for it if you have it. And if you're playing a high power game, then you're probably playing with people who want you to play around interaction because they want to interact with you more frequently.
I don't know necessarily if I fully agree here, mostly because there's a long running joke that commander players need to run more removal, but all of the most popular spells in the format outside of Soul Ring are removal spells, like Swords of Plowshares, Path to Exile, a lot of your other targeted forms of removal, like Cyclonic Rift being both targeted and board wipe. There's a lot of things that can go wrong in a game. Firing off a win condition spell as soon as you have the opportunity to, if it gets you like a guaranteed win with like absolutely no chance of it going wrong outside of a counter spell, sure. But if we're talking, I'm going to living death my entire graveyard back into play and I have a massive board state, but it's not enough to kill any one person. Like you're putting 35 some power onto the board, you're drawing a bunch of cards, but it's only putting someone down to 3, or you're stealing something like 10, 15 everybody.
Yeah, I mean,
There's a
do
very
your
high
due
chance that it's going
diligence.
to do it.
I mean, like if you're gonna kill the board, then yeah, just go for it. But if you can only kill one person, one, don't do that because 3 player games aren't as fun or interesting. But two, that's not actually like very much in your interest to waste your best spell to kill one person or to amass a board that has no actual route to victory. We're on the same page for that, I think. It's just like
Yeah,
if you have it, just go for it. You don't need to play around every single thing. You do what you need to do, but don't make a game go 20 hours, especially the Cyclonic Rift thing. I don't play Cyclonic Rift for exactly this reason. It's not even because of the fact that it's so powerful. It's because it takes so long for everyone to rebuild. It's just not fun. I hate watching people just play out their whole hand, especially people who are like, this can backfire on you if you're playing against like Joyra, for example, where they're just going to draw a million cards as they replay their stuff. But just in general, I hate watching people rebuild their board and waste their turn. Is the worst feeling for me, and I just don't want to inflict that on other people.
My Jorah deck is slightly weaker to Cyclonic Rift than everybody else's, most likely, but most Jorah decks aren't running Bosch Iron Golem. So for me, I will definitely draw several cards. I'll probably discard a hand size and not immediately win, but it would definitely hurt me. I only personally play Cyclonic Rift in a single deck, but it is out to be the villain. You wouldn't expect me to say, "Oh, I don't play Cyclonic Rift in this deck because it's too mean of a card after I've Notion Thief wheeled you." Like that's not the kind of thing that I'm out here to play with at that point.
I
That deck
think
is meant to be the villain.
and those kind of strategies in general, and you see this less now with Breacher gone, but playing like Narset into wheels, like that's another strategy that just takes way too long because nobody has resources. Just playing solitaire. Don't play these cards, guys. At least not
Yeah,
in like 4-player casual commander. Like you can play this in legacy or whatever one-on-one formats, but it's just not fun to play against. There's very few excuses to be doing it.
I don't personally bring that deck out very often for that kind of reason. There's not a ton of call for me to be the villain. The most recent I got to play it was about a month and a half ago, and somebody was like, "Oh yeah, no, I have the Gitrog deck," which that's most Gitrog decks, but
Hmm.
that's beside the point. It's a very combo heavy, very degenerate. I'm just like, okay, I get to go and break out to the fullest potential of what this can do. And in that circumstance, sure, people were playing some pretty cutthroat stuff,
Hmm.
but strangling everybody with the Notion Thief wheel was a very, very satisfying win, even though most of the time I don't feel like it's very appropriate. Because, like, doing that to somebody who's just trying out their Arabo cat deck for the first time, it's like, that's not an experience that's going to let them be like, oh, I want to go do this again. I got to do nothing. That's not really something that you want to do with most people. You really have to go and make sure that the people are like the right audience for that sort of thing.
The context you gave is like appropriate. Like everyone agreed to be at that higher power level, but you definitely wouldn't want to have this with like a newer player, especially someone who's
Oh, no.
just got a pre-con. Like you don't want to be one, you don't want to have like long turns that make them bored, but you also don't want to be playing decks that are gonna completely rob them of any sense of joy, which is basically the same thing.
There's definitely cards that will restrict your resources, which are another big contributor to this, which a lot of people are kind of on the same page of. It's like, wow, this spell doesn't let me untap any of my non basics. This spell killed all my non basics. This one says all my non basics are mountains. I can't do anything with these, and I'm stuck here for a while.
Shout out to Moist Moon coming out of Modern Horizons 3.
Moist.
Looking forward to that.
Just Critical's hair just flowing off of the back of that moon.
Like stacks pieces are kind of a different story a little bit. Like it's tangentially related. I think it should go without saying, don't play stacks in your casual decks. There's
Yeah.
not really any reason to. Like you don't need to stack people out in casual formats because they're already playing relatively slow. Obviously in CDH and high power decks, like go for it because you're actually trying to stop degenerate stuff. But you all kind of agreed to do that, you know?
If you need a blood moon to stop somebody from beating you down with a Croson ground shaker, you've done something wrong with your deck building.
And it
You just
probably
straight
won't
up
do
done
that
something
anyway
terrible.
because green decks are playing a lot of basics. Just nonsensical.
That being said, we touched on this earlier about playing through the deck a few times to kind of get the understanding of how the deck flows in order for you to mitigate the long turn issues. Are there any sort of deck building considerations that you take in with these when you're looking at trying to make sure your deck doesn't do that?
The main thing is just not including do extraneous work like Academy Manufacturer. I think that like this is a very easy thing to do in general because once you've played with a deck a few times, you're gonna know where the durdly parts are and what takes a million years to resolve, especially if it's something that results in a lot of triggers. That's probably the biggest thing for me is just removing the cards that cause this problem to happen, especially if they, don't necessarily contribute to the deck that much and they're just there for value. I think value cards when they take a long time is generally my play style. But things like extra turns, things like rituals, if you're not specifically a storm deck, things like tacking card draw onto everything. This can even be a thing with your commander. Like, if you're having long turns and you're not enjoying it because you're playing a Simic commander and that's boring, I'm building a Simic commander next. Don't even worry about it. But if you're playing a commander that's what they do is take long turns because all they do is grind value, maybe that's a deck building consideration is you should build a different deck altogether. But generally speaking, anything that's going to extend your turn should be looked at critically. And if it doesn't exactly fit with your deck, it might be a time waster for you.
That's where things get a little iffy for me because then we lean into the cards that can be problematic for your deck, for as far as taking longer turns is concerned, but also fit in exactly with what you need. A example with a mono white deck I built recently was mono white vehicles, but it was mostly like a tappy, untappy shenanigan deck with Abdel, Adrian, and Far Traveler. That deck wants to be able to protect itself from board wipes because I'm making a ton of soldiers with Abdel's ETB effect. I need to be able to preserve that board state. Sure, there's other effects that will certainly do the thing, like Teferi's Protection's obviously in there. But for all of my non-token cards that are going to be pertinent to the strategy, there are things that will give me a ton of value and also protect me from board wipes, your Ghost Sways, Eerie Interlude, Lysel's Acrobatics. These are things that you can use offensively to get a bunch of advantage and also defensively to protect against other people. That's where things get a little iffy for me.
I think if it's like specifically good in your deck, I know we keep going back to like the blink thing, but I think it's just because it's such a big perpetrator.
It's a good example.
Yeah, it's a good example. That's kind of the thing is like I wouldn't tell somebody not to play blink cards in their blink deck. If you want to play blink strategy, if you want to play storm, play those cards that I told you not to play. But if you're not explicitly in those strategies, then I think you need to reevaluate like why you want to play those cards. If it's actually good, if it's actually synergistic, great. Don't play extra turn spells just because they're good. Play cards that are good with your commander, play into the theme and play into what commander is and express yourself that way. And but more importantly, respect everybody's time for being there. It's a four person activity. You wouldn't go play any other game and take up the majority of the time because you just had a differently built experience.
Some of the other things that can take a long time to resolve can eventually lead into win conditions. Resolving, say, a wheel effect when you have Scarab God out. Sure, you're going to take a little bit to resolve all the different token generation triggers. You probably have other effects that are making tokens at the same time, like your third path iconoclasts and your young PZs. All those things that make tokens when you cast the spells that are drawing you the cards. But you hit somebody with enough bugs, they're eventually going to die. That's how Windows XP went.
Yeah, I think if you're playing like a creature generator deck like that, another deck building consideration is play Perforos. You probably already are if you're playing, any of the wheel gods. But if you're playing, Perforos or any of the things that like deal damage when things enter, or they let you sacrifice goblin bombardments, those kind of things, that can really help you speed up games as well. Having an
Playing
actual
into the
outlet for your value engine.
playing into the things that will create effects for you, such as having Endrixar in a sacrifice deck, but you also actively have a effect like a Goblin Bombardment, like you mentioned, or a Blood Artist and another secondary sacrifice effect where you don't even necessarily care about what it's doing. Sure, I'm making 2 mana every time I sack one of my Thralls. It's not doing anything. You're literally just doing it to Blood Artist people after you cast creatures.
Yeah.
Finding ways to take your resources and actively turn them into something you can use against your opponents is something that is very important, which some colors can sometimes have a little bit of issues with. But if you're in red or black in any of those game objects decks, most of them are going to be artifacts. You have easy access to Marionette Master and the new Marionette miniature. I forget the name of it. It's a 2-mana Marionette Master.
Apprentice.
That sounds right, yeah. You have red effects that do similar things where the artifacts deal damage when they hit the graveyard. You have a lot of different ways of weaponizing those things. A lot of people are a little bit too caught up, I think, at the deck building stage, where they're like, I need to absolutely make sure that no matter what, I'm going to be able to hit my land drops, draw my cards, and I'm going to overload on those effects that do that, and don't think about the point of where I have 200 clues. How am I going to win?
Yeah, a lot of people definitely build more into the engine and not so much into the outlets. I also, like, Endrixar actually reminded me of another problem child for this. and you don't see them too often because we don't get them too often. But cards that do things on other people's upkeep, I love these cards. I love playing these cards, but it's probably like the worst to deal with, right? Is like, hey, I'm gonna start my turn. It's like, we're gonna start our turn. I'm gonna do things as well. Just, making tokens and things like that, which again, I love playing these cards, but it is so obnoxious to have to like stop people in their upkeep and be like, I'm gonna do this thing too.
It's very easy to shortcut that in my experience if you have very few examples of that. My Dragon list has a single Belladros Witherbloom. It used to have the dragon that made Devour Dragons, but they kind of swapped the spots because they did similar roles. But Belladros also doubled my mana. All I was saying, every time an upkeep would happen on an opponent's turn, I wouldn't go through the whole rigmarole of saying, like, on your upkeep, I'm going to go make a pest token. I'm just going to be pest, pest, pest. That's all I'm going to do because most of the time, like, they did not have removal for it, so it's just got to stay around for several turns. So people knew what to expect, and you should be able to verbally shortcut with the group after you've played with them for a while to be like, yep, pest here, pest here, pest here.
Yeah, I've gotten to the point where I, with my play group that I know when they're not going to interact, they'll tell me, and it's not too hard to just keep track and just take away the one you would have gotten if you do happen to lose the thing. But it is something you gotta like communicate, especially if you're in a, if you're at your LGS and you're in a blind pod, like you need to let people know like this is gonna make a bug on every person's upkeep. So let me know if that's a thing that you're gonna try to prevent. This is also like a thing with you see this actually on Magic Online quite a bit, where people hold priority because they don't want to do anything unless you interact with a piece on their board. So they're holding up like a counter spell or like something to give it hexproof or whatever it is. And it's also like a thing in paper, but in paper, obviously, you can just kind of chime in whenever. You don't have to worry about missing your chance to do it. But with the upkeep thing, it's like I don't want to like actually have to say anything. I'm just gonna tick up my dice every time. But again, communicate with your play group because a random group, I think you're trying to be sly with it, and you don't want to be the guy who they think is trying to like cheat out the board or something.
They're not going to notice how many pests I have.
I don't know. They don't know I have cheaty face in the backs of all my sleeves.
I'm going to go exile my entire pile of pests over here. Don't worry about it. I'm just going to leave them on the board. Surprise, G-Face. I cannot wait to do that one of these days.
Imagine. This is also a thing if you play against like rule zero decks. Like sometimes you have weird interactions, or if you're playing against like not even like a rule zero, like if you're playing like Magar, where they have it has a really weird effect that you have to keep track of like your cards. Okay, this is gonna sound like really petty, but I hate morph cards for this reason. Actually, cards that are upside down that you have to keep track of are so obnoxious. It's great on Magic Online, but in paper, just I'm constantly having to pick up my cards and look at it and make sure I'm attacking with the right thing. Oh, I hate it. It is a huge time waster for me.
For me, I actually really enjoy the foretell mechanic, but I also kind of metagame in a slight way, mostly just because I have a few people that I play with consistently. For the most part, I'm getting in with random people, but there are a couple people who I will get games in more often with than not. And any one deck I have a foretell card in, I always want to make sure there's at least two of them. I never want my opponents to ever know which one of the two I have face down, so they can't just like, oh, he foretold the prevent board wipe spell. So I got to make sure that I have a second board wipe or a counter spell for him. It's like, oh, is that going to be that one, or is it going to be the one that makes a bird out of my artifact? For me, foretell is a very strong mechanic that I find is worth playing the face down things, but I've not found any sort of comparable equity of card quality with stuff like Morph or Megamorph or anything like that that makes me want to do it. So I've not personally had that experience with the face down cards, but if some 40 odd instants and sorceries in your deck are going to be turned face down into creatures because Magar says, I animate you and have you to attack my opponents. Yeah, I could imagine that being very frustrating.
It's probably like Kadena players must be like living in a nightmare because they probably have so many cards. And like I like Cloak a little bit better, but mainly because I think it's a lot more intentional to cloak your cards. Like I don't know. I feel like I guess they really are the same, but Cloak just feels better, and it might be because there's things often attached to Cloak as well, like the equipment that we just got. I really like Plot because they're upright. I don't have to they're face up. I guess I don't have to keep track of that.
I think that Cloak is one of the ones that can lead to our subject matter of the longer game states, though, with very specific interactions. I can imagine that somebody going and resolving a bunch of effects from the new Vanifar that can cloak creatures from your hand,
Hmm.
and then, or cloak anything from your hand, rather, and then you can turn them face up later. There's going to be a lot of effects that are going to have that flip back over and over again. We're talking about your Ixodrons, your other effects like that, just causing a bunch of face downing to keep on occurring. It's going to be a deck that's very convoluted in the way that it controls the board and also how it's going to resolve its effects, because you're going to want to cloak some giant monstrosity and then flip it back over on its front face with a blink spell into that deck. It's like, all right, I'm going to go cloak this. I'm going to go flip it. It's a Diluvian Primordial. I'm going to cast those 3 of your spells from each of your graveyards. I'm going to have to resolve each of those. That's another good example of something that's going to go and take a lot of time to resolve, is any sort of Primordial or reanimating specific number of creatures from graveyard type spells. Like, I'm not talking like Rise of the Dark Realms. You just go, okay, give me everything that isn't phase from all your graveyards. You call it a day. But if we're talking about the Phyrexian one, Breach the Multiverse, you gotta be like, okay, what's the best one I need from here? What's the best one I need from here? Like, that alone is a nightmare. And throw Enters the Battlefield effects on top of it. You've taken 5 minutes for creating a board that's just gonna get damnation the next turn.
Yeah, I think you can lump that in with basically any effect that makes you search your opponent's zones. And you don't see these very often because they're annoying and quite frankly not that good. But there are a lot of cards actually in the game that let you like search your opponent's library for cards and things like that. It takes a year to resolve. It always because your opponents just don't know your decks that well half the time, and they don't know what they're looking for either. Like they're just trying to get value. There's even some commanders that do this specifically. It is the worst. I think in general, I just wouldn't play cards that make you search your opponent's zones. Like Primordial, sure. If you're a graveyard deck, sure, whatever. But if you're not, please don't play these cards. Don't play any of the cards either that are like I can't think of one specifically off the top of my head, but there's at least 3 I can think of that go exile things out of your opponent's library. One, it's annoying. It feels bad, but it also takes a long time. I see people talk about that. I'll talk about this with Brouhaha as well, but it's just the worst thing in the world. There's no reason to be playing these cards, and it takes too long to resolve. Stop it.
I don't want to be prescriptive with what cards I'm telling people to play. Personally, I think that if you revel in the misery, I think that you are well within your means to do this. But I think that there's a very specific type of character that wants to do that sort of thing. And somebody out there is probably listening to this and being like, all right, I need to write all these down so I can be as evil as possible the next game and take half an hour to go and make everybody mad at me. As long as they're doing it in such a way to where it's like, they're not playing it off like, oh, I don't know what these are doing. It's like, no, if you're playing into the villain role, it's like, yeah, try to stop me. Then I think that most of the issues here can be less problematic in some
If you want to
respects.
play with all the cards that we're calling problematic right now, I hope you find a play group that enjoys it genuinely. I think most people, I could pretty safely say, will not. Don't be a dick about it. Like if you want to play a deck that's stronger and be arch enemy, that's fine. I don't know. Just be respectful of everybody's time and make sure they know what they signed up for.
The archenemy role is exactly the kind of person I'm thinking of here. They're the person that is going to have the 8 counter spells. They're going to have the blowing up of non-basic lands, like not necessarily mass land destruction so much as just like, no, you can't have that. That land is a no. You are not allowed. They're the permission player. They're going to be the Mogus player. They're going to be the person that's going to be doing that kind of villainous stuff. And if they're also playing stuff that's going to Gaunty your opponents, as an example, I'm talking 4 mana Gaunty. I've actually not seen the new Sultai one in action just yet, but same, but different kind of vibe. If they're going to repeatedly Gaunty you with the 4 mana one and blink it over and over again, just be going over here with the Neon Genesis
Hmm.
Evangelion look, it's like, yeah. As long as they're playing into it and taking the long game actions and trying to like get everybody in on the action, that's the big thing. Because if you're trying to go and play this off like you don't know what kind of reaction you're causing with the table, I think that it's genuinely going to frustrate people. But if you're getting people involved in it and being like trying to go and get this to be a shared experience, I think that it can make these less problematic. I can't say that it's going to cause it to go completely away, but I think it's going to make it a lot better.
I hate steel decks in general, but I think you're right on the money. It's like as long as you've communicated with your group, no matter what you're doing, if you're taking a long turn or several long turns, or that's just kind of deck you're playing, as long as your play group is like signed up for it, that's fine. This is more about being respectful of people's time and like being upfront with it and generally communicating, like, especially if you're in a blind pod, you want to tell people like this is a storm deck, expect a long turn at some point, or doing your best to avoid getting in these situations in the first place if you can. Like I make it a point because I don't get to play as Magic as much as I would like to, and I would like to spend more of that time actually playing with my friends and not not trying to resolve a million triggers from a deck that's kind of obnoxious to play with and play against anyway.
Which some decks are just gonna have that happen. I do remember, I believe it's Matt Morgan who had a deck that was built around Tom Bombadil, and those decks are kind of the big perpetrator for this exact discussion. We're talking about sagas. They have a lot of game actions that they're doing. They have a lot of control elements. They have a lot of secondary triggers. Like just trying to remember how each of the sagas are going to resolve in a turn can be nightmarish. I should know because before Bombadil, I had a Ramos Sagas deck, and I experienced those exact things myself. But as players, there's a lot of things you can do to try to help with those sort of things to mitigate the time it takes to resolve those several game actions. And one of the best ones is just planning out your turns ahead. There's not really any sort of reason for you to not do that, but it's also not something that's very intuitive for some players. Like if you're playing mostly creature beatdown decks in the majority of the games you're doing before, you're like big rampy stompy stuff, and then you're going to something like sagas, it's not necessarily a skill you've practiced to be like, okay, as soon as my turn resolves, I'm going to have these things that happen, and I need to go resolve them in an optimal order and do it quickly. So it's sometimes just a muscle some people don't use, but it's a very good one to keep in mind. It's just to have that sort of focus going into a turn and kind of seeing and evaluating things before it and knowing exactly how these are going to play out and making sure that you do it quickly and you're communicating it efficiently with everybody else so they know what's going on.
That's actually a great point. I can't believe I didn't think of it. Something that we can do, is actually plan out our turns. And this is something I think that we probably do just on instinct. I think it's probably one of the more interesting things to do while you're playing a game is to actually plan your turn while the other turns are happening. In fact, I get to the point where I make my plan and I actually put my hand down on the table because I don't need to look at it anymore. I pretty much get it figured out to the point where my turn is going to be pretty much set in stone. Obviously, you're going to draw a card and gain more information. The board state might be a little bit different by the time it gets back to you, but it's pretty easy to actually look at your hand. You've only got so many cards. Obviously, if you draw a million cards, that's going to be a little bit different, but it's not that hard to look at your hand, look at the board state, and decide how you're going to use your turn. Got generally a long time to figure that out. And if you don't, it's probably like the early turns in the game, right? And you don't have much to do anyway. But I think that's a very easy way that you can help mitigate this problem yourself.
One of the best examples I can give for that sort of thing is just strategies that aren't very convoluted are the ones that are best for this. If you're playing a deck that's built all around sacrificing big creatures, and that's your general MO, you know what spells you're going to use to sack those big creatures with. It's untap, draw, combat, smack you with the big thing, draw all of the stuff by sacking the big thing, and then your post-combat main phase maybe a little more time invested. It's like, do I want to go play this particular spell, or do I want to hold out mana for removal? Like, sure, at that point, it's going to be a little bit more of a hassle, but going into a turn like that for most strategies, especially ones that are built around big creature beatdowns, there's a lot less decision paths, and knowing who you're going to prioritize your attacking with on the turns beforehand is going to be some of an exercise that you should be doing anyway. Going into your turn, watching the other turns going on, you're seeing a certain player is doing some very powerful things, but they haven't necessarily put any blockers in play. You probably already know as soon as you go to combat on your turn, you're going to smack them for a bunch. You shouldn't be taking any sort of like deliberations and considerations during your pre-combat main phase. Like, well, they did a big thing, but you made me mad last turn. Like, no, you should be worrying about that stuff on other people's turns. Thinking is not a sorcery speed action.
Speaking of which, please stop casting your instants at sorcery speed. This is something
Uh,
as well. This is something that I see all the time, especially with players who don't play as often, is that they're gonna start their turn and they're gonna start looking around the board for things to kill with instant speed spells. They don't really do any threat assessment on other people's turns. They do it on their turn. The worst. I hate it. And you always see
See,
it. You know exactly what they're doing because they're like looking at everybody's permanents and they're looking for a thing to kill instead of evaluating that threat the rest of the turn cycle.
I will cast my instance at sorcery speed on some occasions, but that's going to be in more extraneous circumstances. Like if there's a blue player that's tapped down, I'm not going to give them the opportunity to go and counter my removal on their important thing. I think that that's a good example of something like that, but I think there's more nuance to it than that. But I think that if you're a newer player, especially, playing around things at instant speed instead of doing it sorcery speed is a general rule you should be following. But there's exceptions to every rule.
Yeah, this is definitely something you see more with newer players or less experienced players. Because obviously, like I do this all the time. I cast my instance of sorcery speed all the time. So I'm doing it to play around things, or I'm doing it because it's going to let me see more cards because it's drawing me cards. I'm playing Brainstorm in my main phase. There are times and places to do it, but don't be wasting your time on other people's turns to not look at your hands and evaluate what you can use. Even if you
Yeah,
have to cast it at main phase because you're waiting for the blue player to tap out for whatever reason, then you should at least have that figured out. You shouldn't be looking around and doing all this thinking on your turn because your turn is not the time for you to be thinking. It's the time for you to be acting and other people to be interacting with you.
like I said, thinking is not a sorcery speed action.
As we come up on the hour mark here, I think that's a good place to wrap things up. Really glad how this conversation went. I really wanted to air out these thoughts because this is something that everybody deals with. Everybody's going to have to deal with at some point, and it's going to continue to happen. This isn't a problem that you can 100% solve because it's just a complicated game. But
Yeah, no matter how many times you've played this game, if you're going to try to resolve an entire battlefield worth of tokens entering the battlefield with manufacture and a chatterfang in play with a bunch of different sacrifice effects that only work with creatures versus artifacts, you're going to take a long time to do that no matter how many years you've been playing this game. It's just how the nature of some cards and playing a deck that you're not familiar with. Like if I were to go pick up someone's, what's a deck strategy I've never played, Yannette deck, for example, depending on their brew, some of them could be very top deck manipulation heavy. Some of them could just be like, I'm just going to fill the entire deck full of giant 7 drops and 9 drops and just, I'm going to brute force the math on it. Like, if I don't know what that Yannette deck is doing besides I can't even, then I really don't. Like, I'm going to take a long time to play that deck, where someone who built it is going to be like, oh, no, this is the optimal line. This is super easy. But again, there's some factors that are outside of our control when we're getting in with a game with players. And I think that being respectful of like those sort of situations is just as important as recognizing how to speed up those turns on your own speed when you're playing stuff that you're more familiar with.
I think the bottom line to take away from this is it's okay to take long turns. Just don't make it your fault if you can help it.
Or at least kill everybody when you do.
Yeah, or that. That's also acceptable. People listening to the podcast, I would like to know what is the longest game of Commander you've ever played, and what is the longest turn you've ever watched somebody else play. I would like to know that because I don't think anybody is not going to have a story like that. So make sure that you subscribe to the channel if you're watching on YouTube. Follow the podcast if you're listening on Spotify or whatever channel you prefer. And thank you for tuning in.